What if I told you that in the heart of the Australian outback, beneath a blazing sun that showed no mercy, 4 men sat waiting for rescue that would arrive exactly 9 hours too late? What if I told you that the difference between life and death, between triumph and tragedy, between being remembered as heroes or cautionary tales, came down to a single tree, a buried message, and a decision made in exhaustion that would haunt a nation for generations? Before we journey into one of the most devastating stories of exploration ever recorded, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and whether you've ever heard whispers of the Burke and Wills expedition, the journey that promised to unite a continent, but instead tore apart the very fabric of survival itself. This is not just another tale of explorers who ventured too far. This is the story of ambition colliding with the unforgiving Australian desert, of leadership failures that cascaded into catastrophe, of Indigenous wisdom ignored in favor of colonial arrogance, and of a moment so cruelly ironic that when rescuers finally reached Cooper Creek, they found themselves staring at a scene that would become seared into Australian consciousness forever. The year was 1861, and what began as the most lavishly funded, most publicly celebrated exploration in Australian history would end in a campsite littered with the remnants of hope, journals filled with desperate final words, and bodies that told a story more powerful than any expedition report ever could. Robert O'Hara Burke was not your typical explorer. Born in Ireland in 1821, he had served as a police inspector in Melbourne, a man known more for his administrative capabilities and his striking presence than for any bushcraft or survival expertise. He was tall, commanding, with a military bearing that inspired confidence in drawing rooms and government offices. He had never led an expedition into the interior. He had never navigated by the stars across trackless desert. He had never lived off the land when supplies ran out. But he had something the Royal Society of Victoria valued even more in 1860. He had charisma, political connections, and the absolute certainty that he could accomplish what no one else had dared. The mission was audacious, unprecedented, and captured the imagination of a young colony desperate to prove itself. Crossed the entire Australian continent from Melbourne in the south to the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north, over 2,000 miles through terrain that had swallowed previous expeditions whole, and returned to tell the tale. The prize wasn't just geographical knowledge, it was national pride, scientific prestige, and for Burke personally, a chance to etch his name into history alongside the great explorers of the age. William John Wills was Burke's opposite in almost every way. And perhaps that's why their partnership would become so tragically iconic. 26 years old, English-born, Wills was a trained surveyor and astronomer. Meticulous where Burke was impulsive, analytical where Burke was emotional, and possessed of the technical skills that Burke entirely lacked. He kept detailed journals, made precise astronomical observations, and understood the scientific method in ways that Burke never could. Wills was quiet, introspective, devoted to his widowed father, and approached the expedition with a scholar's curiosity rather than a conqueror's bravado. Where Burke saw the interior as a challenge to be dominated, Wills saw it as a puzzle to be understood. And yet, in the crucial moments when his expertise should have overruled Burke's judgment, Wills remained deferential, loyal to a fault, unable or unwilling to challenge the commander whose decisions would lead them both to their graves. The expedition that departed Royal Park in Melbourne on August 20, 1860, was a spectacle unlike anything the colony had witnessed. 15,000 people gathered to watch the IECOSO procession. 26 camels imported from India and Afghanistan, 23 horses, 6 wagons loaded with supplies meant to last 2 years, and 19 men carefully selected for their various skills. The supplies were absurdly extravagant and tragically impractical. They carried a large oak table and matching chairs, a Chinese gong, rockets for signaling, enough scientific instruments to equip a small university, and tons of food preserved in the latest methods. What they didn't adequately carry was humility, flexibility, or any meaningful consultation with the Indigenous Australians who had survived and thrived in these lands for 60,000 years. The expedition's attitude toward the Aboriginal people they would encounter ranged from dismissive indifference to outright hostility, a fatal blindness that would cost them everything. But even before the expedition reached the true interior, the cracks in Burke's leadership began to show like fault lines in drought-stricken earth. He was impatient, temperamental, and made decisions with a commander's authority, but without a bushman's wisdom. At Menindee, just a few months into the journey, Burke made his first catastrophic choice. He split the expedition. Frustrated by the slow pace, convinced that a rival expedition led by John McDowell Stewart might beat him to the Gulf, Burke took a smaller, faster group ahead, while leaving the bulk of supplies and men to follow. This decision shattered the Aussie expedition's unity and created a cascade of miscommunications that would prove lethal. Burke's group pushed on to Cooper Creek, a remote waterway in what is now western Queensland, where they established Depot Camp 65 on November 11, 1860. Here, Burke made his second fateful decision. He would take just 3 men, Wills, John King, and Charles Gray, and make a lightning dash to the Gulf, leaving 4 men behind at Cooper Creek under the command of William Brahe, with instructions to wait 3 months. Think about that for a moment. Burke was about to attempt a journey of over 1,500 miles round trip, through country that no European had successfully crossed, with minimal supplies and in the brutality of the Australian summer, and he expected to complete it in just 3 months. It was hubris on a scale that defied reason, yet no one could dissuade him. The men left behind at Cooper Creek, William Brahe, William Patton, Thomas McDonough, and Dost Muhammad, watched as Burke, Wills, King, and Gray departed on December 16, 1860, their camels loaded, their spirits high, completely unaware that they were riding toward an appointment with death. The journey north was brutal beyond imagination. The expedition crossed the stony desert, where the ground radiated heat like the surface of the sun, and water became more precious than gold. They pushed through the Channel country, where ancient river systems created mazes of mudflats and impossible terrain. They endured temperatures that made metal too hot to touch, and nights that offered no relief from the day's torment. Charles Gray, the strongest of them physically, began to weaken, secretly eating more than his share of the dwindling rations, creating tensions that simmered beneath the surface of their desperate march. But Burke was obsessed with reaching the Gulf, with planting his flag, with proving that he could accomplish what others said was impossible. And on February 11, 1861, approximately 60 miles from the Gulf of Carpentaria, struggling through mangrove swamps and tropical vegetation utterly unlike the desert they'd crossed, they caught sight of tidal waters. They had done it. They had crossed the continent. But the mangroves were impenetrable, the mosquitoes were maddening, and they couldn't actually reach the open Gulf. So close to total triumph, they were denied even the satisfaction of standing on the northern shore. They turned back, and that's when their journey transformed from an epic's adventure into a death march. The return journey was where everything unraveled like a rope fraying strand by strand until nothing held. They were already exhausted, their supplies were critically low, and the landscape they'd crossed in summer's heat was now entering autumn with its own challenges. Charles Gray's condition deteriorated rapidly. He became delirious, could barely sit his camel, and on April 17, 1861, he died, likely from a combination of starvation, dysentery, and exhaustion. The Aussie 3 survivors buried him in a shallow grave marked by a simple mound of stones, and the delay of digging that grave in their weakened state, the psychological blow of losing one of their number, and the grim knowledge that they were now racing against their own mortality, sent ripples of desperation through the remaining men. Burke became more tyrannical in his decisions, Wills more withdrawn, and John King, the youngest, simply tried to survive each day. They were consuming their camels one by one, the very animals that were supposed to carry them home, and with each animal slaughtered for food, their range of movement shrank. They were moving slower, weaker, more vulnerable, and the Cooper Creek depot that represented their only hope of salvation was still hundreds of miles away. Back at Cooper Creek, William Brahe faced an agonizing dilemma that would define him for the rest of his life. Burke had said to wait 3 months. It had now been 4 months and 5 days. The supplies were running low, the men were suffering from scurvy, and there had been no sign, no message, no indication whatsoever that Burke's party was returning or even alive. Brahe made the decision that seemed rational, that followed his order's spirit if not their letter, that any reasonable person might have made under the circumstances. On April 21, 1861, he abandoned the depot. Before leaving, Brahe buried supplies, flour, rice, oatmeal, sugar, and dried meat at the base of a large coolabah tree. On that tree, he carved a simple message: Dig 3 FT, NWAPR, 21, 1861. The tree would become known as the Dig Tree, one of the most iconic and haunting landmarks in Australian history, a silent witness to timing so cruel it seems orchestrated by fate itself. Because 9 hours after Brahe's party left Cooper Creek, 9 hours after they rode north believing Burke's expedition had perished in the interior, Burke, Wills, and King staggered into the camp. Imagine their elation turning to crushing despair as they realized the camp was abandoned. Imagine Wills seeing the carving on the tree, digging frantically, finding the supplies, and realizing they had missed their rescue by less than half a day. The journals record their devastation in words that crack with emotion. We had arrived just in time to enjoy the mockery of the tree, its carved directions pointing to supplies that represented survival, yet also the cruelest evidence that they had been abandoned, deemed dead by the very men who were supposed to wait for them. They had enough supplies for a few weeks, but they were utterly broken in body and spirit, and they faced an impossible choice. Try to follow Brahe's party, who had a 9-hour head start and fresh animals, or attempt to reach a distant pastoral station at Mount Hopeless, over 150 miles away through country they'd never seen. Burke made another catastrophic decision, one that Wills disagreed with but couldn't overrule. They would go southwest toward Mount Hopeless rather than north after Brahe. Why? Perhaps Burke's pride couldn't bear the idea of being rescued, of admitting he needed help from the men he'd left behind. Perhaps he genuinely believed they couldn't catch Brahe's party. Perhaps exhaustion had clouded his judgment beyond repair. Whatever the reason, they took the supplies from the dig tree and headed in the wrong direction. But in a decision that seems almost incomprehensible in hindsight, they didn't leave any message at the tree, indicating they'd returned. They didn't carve a new message, didn't leave any sign they were alive. When Brahe's party, racked with guilt, returned to Cooper Creek just days later to check one final time, they found the camp exactly as they'd left it, the dig tree unmarked with any new message, and they concluded that Burke had never returned, that the supplies they'd buried were still waiting undiscovered. They left again, and the dig tree kept its secret. Burke, Wills, and King made it about 50 miles toward Mount Hopeless before reality asserted itself with brutal finality. They couldn't make it. They were too weak, the country was too harsh, and they had vastly underestimated the distance and difficulty. They turned back toward Cooper Creek, to the only place they knew, to the tree that had become both their salvation and their doom. On the way back, they encountered groups of Yandrawanda people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Cooper Creek region who knew this land intimately, who could read its moods and find sustenance where Europeans saw only desolation. And here the tragedy deepens into something almost unbearable. The Yandrawanda tried to help them. They offered nardu, a type of fern seed that was a staple food when properly prepared, grinding the spores into flour that could sustain life through the lean seasons. But nardu requires careful preparation, leaching to remove toxins and enzymes that prevent nutrient absorption. And Burke and Wills, despite Wills's meticulous documentation of the process, never prepared it correctly. They were eating food that filled their stomachs but starved their bodies, destroying what little thiamine they had left, accelerating rather than preventing their deaths from malnutrition. The relationship with the Yandrawanda became complicated, fraught with cultural misunderstandings and Burke's increasing paranoia. There were moments of genuine kindness, indigenous people bringing fish and showing them how to harvest resources, but there were also moments when Burke, in his deteriorating mental state, fired his pistol to drive them away, convinced they were stealing when they were likely just confused by the strange, sick white men who couldn't even feed themselves in a land of plenty. John King, the youngest and least proud, developed the best relationship with the indigenous people, and it would be this relationship that saved his life while his commanders perished. By late June 1861, Burke and Wills were dying, and they knew it with the absolute clarity that comes at the end. Their journals, which had been precise records of astronomical observations and geographical notes, devolved into desperate, fragmented final messages. Wills wrote to his father with heartbreaking formality, apologizing for his failure, expressing love, and documenting his symptoms with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing his own demise. Burke, always more emotional, swung between despair and delusion, between accepting his fate and raging against it. On June 28, 1861, they made their last camp together at Cooper Creek, unable to move further, and there they waited for death with King trying desperately to keep them alive, to bring them water, to force them to eat the inadequately prepared nardu that was killing them as surely as starvation would. Burke died sometime around June 28 or 29. The exact date uncertain because King was too weak and traumatized to record it precisely. Wills survived a few days longer. His last journal entry dated June 29, 1861. A note of scientific observations mixed with personal farewell, ending with words that echo across time. My spirits are excellent. He died at the camp, likely on June 30th, and King was left alone, the sole survivor of the dash party, surrounded by the bodies of his commanders and facing his own imminent death in the vast indifference of the Australian bush. But King did something Burke and Wills couldn't. He surrendered his pride and fully embraced the help of the Yandrawanda people, who took him in, fed him properly prepared food, nursed him slowly back from the brink, and kept him alive for over 2 months until the rescue parties finally arrived. And when the rescue parties came, when Alfred Howitt's search expedition reached Cooper Creek on September 15, 1861, they found a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. John King was barely recognizable, skeletal, sunburned, almost black, clothed in rags, but alive. And nearby, in the brutal clarifying sunlight of the Australian interior, they found the bodies. Burke was buried quickly after his death by King, but Wills's body lay in their final camp, partially preserved by the dry conditions, his journals beside him. Nearby was William Patton, one of Bra's men who had died on the return journey north, and Gray's lonely grave marker still stood where they'd left it months before. 4 bodies, 4 men who ventured into the unknown and found only death. Their story written in scattered journals, marked by a carved tree, and remembered in the silence of the land that refused to yield to their ambition. The scene Howitt's party discovered was devastating in its intimacy and its waste. Wills's journals lay open, his astronomical instruments carefully packed, his final observations recorded with scientific precision even as his body failed. Burke's effects were scattered, evidence of a man who fought until the very end, who couldn't accept that nature didn't care about his determination. The supplies from the dig tree, partially consumed, sat as mute testimony to how close they'd come to survival. And the dig tree itself, that Coolibah still standing today, carved with its message that had been both salvation and curse, stood over the scene like a monument to miscommunication, bad timing, and the cruel mathematics of exploration where 9 hours meant the difference between rescue and death. The public reaction in Melbourne and across Australia was seismic, a combination of grief, outrage, and desperate need to find meaning in meaningless tragedy. Burke and Wills were simultaneously elevated to martyrs and criticized for their failures. There were royal commissions, investigations, finger-pointing, and attempts to assign blame to everyone from Burke's leadership to Bra's decision to leave to the expedition's organizers, who sent ill-prepared men into impossible conditions. But beneath the official inquiries was a deeper reckoning. Australia's interior was not like the African plains or the American West. It required different knowledge, different respect, and most importantly, genuine partnership with the Indigenous people who understood it. The expedition's failure to meaningfully engage with Aboriginal knowledge wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a fatal flaw that represented the broader colonial attitude that Indigenous wisdom was primitive rather than sophisticated, irrelevant, rather than essential. John King's survival told a counter-narrative that was uncomfortable for colonial Australia to fully embrace. He lived because he abandoned European pride and accepted Indigenous help without reservation. The Yandrawanda people saved him not because they had to, not because he conquered or impressed them, but because their culture valued human life and hospitality even toward strange, sick foreigners, who had shown them both kindness and aggression. King testified at the ACE inquiries, praising the Indigenous people who saved him, but his testimony was often downplayed or ignored because it complicated the heroic narrative of European exploration. He was rewarded with a small pension and lived until 1872, haunted by survivor's guilt and the memories of watching his commanders die when salvation had been so close, so agonizingly close. The bodies of Burke and Wills were exhumed months later and brought back to Melbourne for a state funeral that drew over 40,000 mourners, nearly the entire population of the city. They were buried with full honors, their graves became pilgrimage sites, statues were erected, and their names entered the pantheon of Australian explorers, alongside Cook and Flinders and the other men who charted the continent. But there's something deeply troubling about how their failure was transformed into heroic legend, how their poor decisions became excusable in the mythology of men bravely facing the unknown, while the Indigenous, people who tried to save them, who succeeded in saving King, remained marginalized in the official histories for generations. The dig tree still stands, protected now, a tourist site, and people come from around the world to stand beneath its branches and imagine that April day when timing failed and hope died. What lessons crystallized from the dirt of Cooper Creek, from the scattered journals and the 4 bodies that marked the expedition's terrible cost? First and most obvious, humility. Before nature is not weakness, but wisdom. Burke's fatal flaw wasn't ambition, it was the arrogance that made him believe willpower could overcome inexperience, that determination could substitute for knowledge, and that he could force the land to yield rather than learning to work with it. Every Indigenous culture that has survived in harsh environments understands what Burke never learned. You don't conquer the desert, you develop relationship with it. You learn its language, and you respect its power. Second, leadership requires more than charisma and confidence. It requires expertise, flexibility, and the ability to admit when you're wrong. Burke made disastrous decisions and compounded them by refusing to reconsider, by prioritizing speed over safety, pride over pragmatism, and his own vision over the collective wisdom of those around him. Wills had the technical knowledge to navigate them home, but he lacked the authority or confidence to challenge Burke's judgment, a dynamic that appears again and again in survival disasters where hierarchies prevent life-saving descent. The question that haunts every analysis of the expedition is simple and terrible. What if Wills had insisted they leave a message at the dig tree? What if he'd overruled Burke's decision to head for Mount Hopeless? What if technical expertise had been valued over commanding presence? Third, and perhaps most profound, the knowledge of those who belong to a place is not primitive superstition to be dismissed but refined wisdom accumulated over millennia. The Yandrawanda people who saved King knew how to read the land, find water in apparent wasteland, prepare Nardu safely, and survive seasons that killed European explorers in weeks. They tried to share this knowledge, but Burke and Wills couldn't receive it, blinded by cultural superiority that literally cost them their lives. The tragic irony is that Australia was never empty, was never terra nullius, was never a blank map waiting for European explorers to fill in its details. It was intimately known, carefully managed, and deeply understood by cultures that had thrived there for 60,000 years. The Burke and Wills expedition failed not because Australia was unknowable, but because they refused to learn from those who knew it best. Fourth, timing and communication are sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph, between death and survival, and we ignore these details at our peril. 9 hours. A message left on a tree. A decision to check one more time. Any of these tiny changes might have saved Burke and Wills, might have transformed Australian history, might have turned disaster into legendary success. But they also reveal how precarious exploration always was, how dependent on chance and detail, how the difference between remembered heroes and cautionary tales can be as arbitrary as when someone decides to leave a camp, or how clearly they mark their passing. Finally, and most universally, there's a profound message here about redemption, not for Burke and Wills who found none, but for how we understand and remember failure. King redeemed himself not through achievement, but through surrender, through accepting help, through surviving when his commanders died. The Yandrawanda people demonstrated a grace that colonial Australia barely acknowledged, showing compassion to strangers who had no claim on their assistance. And modern Australia has slowly, incompletely, begun to redeem the narrative, to acknowledge Indigenous perspectives, to recognize that the history of exploration is also a history of invasion, displacement, and the systematic devaluation of Indigenous knowledge that persisted long after Burke and Wills died at Cooper Creek. The dig tree still stands today, gnarled and ancient, its carved message still visible beneath protective covering, and it asks us uncomfortable questions. What are we willing to sacrifice for ambition? When does confidence become dangerous arrogance? Whose knowledge do we dismiss because it doesn't come wrapped in credentials we recognize? And how do we honor the dead, those 4 bodies waiting at Cooper Creek, without mythologizing their failures or erasing the Indigenous people whose land this was, whose wisdom could have saved them, and whose descendants still live with the legacy of colonization that the Burke and Wills expedition represents? If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about leadership, humility, the price of ambition, and the wisdom of listening to those who know better, then let me ask you to do something. Hit that like button, because it tells YouTube that stories like this matter, that history with nuance and complexity deserves to be shared. Drop a comment below telling me what struck you most about this tragedy, whether the 9-hour miss, the failure to leave a message, or the Indigenous people who saved King but couldn't save his commanders. Share this video with someone who loves history, exploration stories, or needs a reminder that nature and Indigenous knowledge deserve profound respect. And subscribe to this channel because we're committed to telling stories that don't just entertain but challenge, that don't just recount events but ask what they mean for how we live today. The bodies at Cooper Creek were waiting not just for rescue but for us to learn from them, and the lesson is eternal. Humility, respect, and the wisdom to learn from those who know better aren't signs of weakness but the very foundations of survival. Burke and Wills died as they lived, proud and determined, but their greatest legacy might be teaching us what they never learned themselves.